got to accept yourself on some level. Yeah, Jeff's ideal. I'd love to sing like Jeff, but you've got to ground yourself and accept what you are and make the most out of what you are. And maybe accept, a smaller range and a limited voice. And you learn to make the most out of that. Take the simple thing in front of you, as Jordan would say, clean your room. And of course, many of the approaches and the mindsets that I developed that helped me start to approach myself differently came from him sort of installing in constantly these ideas and all his talks about humility, groundedness, and thinking iteratively, step by step, just trying to get small wins and then gradually evolving it into bigger wins. These were huge virtues for someone like me, huge virtues. And they took a huge amount of discipline. They took me letting go of my dreams. I remember I sat down at one point and said, I'm going to give up on my dreams. I'm going to admit I failed. That hurt so much. That was a huge deal for me to say that to myself. Yeah, you failed. You didn't make your dreams happen. It was almost like a betrayal of my will to power in my head. But weirdly, then, once I let go of that silly, childish dreaming and just said, you know what, I'm going to make the most out of what I am and see where I can take that, and took iterative steps. Basically a year later, I was producing music, and I was like, man, this isn't bad. I actually like this music. I'd listen to this. Whereas most of my other stuff, man, you should hear it. I was like, oh man, you wouldn't listen to that. You'd rather beat a cat with a baseball bat, you know what I mean? And this was fascinating for me. This was a big, big deal because it was grounding me in the reality of what I was. It made me embrace my reality, and it required virtues, and it required sacrifice of my delusional persona in order to achieve this. All the Jungian stuff happened to me in that process. It really changed my personality and gave me personality, and out of that came style and creativity and uniqueness, which is quite fascinating. And the unity of these two opposites were sort of happened within me. My idealism got firmly grounded in something that is real. And of course, I thank Jordan immensely for taking the time and effort to put his stuff out there for that, because he changed the course of my life. He taught me virtues that I refused to embrace, and they caused me pain and failure. When I just humbled my ass and embraced them, I became successful. And it was that simple, Now, this is all very fascinating stuff when you contrast it with what is now happening in a culture, which is something we call the metaverse. I'm going to talk about that now. So when it comes to the metaverse, the reason why I would take this idea serious is because people like Mark Zuckerberg are talking about it, and it's been floating around for quite a while. It's the thesis about the next step after smartphones in our way that we interact with technology. You should always take things Zuckerberg says seriously. He was the guy who got ahead of the social media trend. Of course, he set up Facebook and whatnot. These people aren't fools. You may not like the metaverse, you may not like what's going on, but it's coming, and it's a real deal, and you must prepare for these type of things. Social media was a real deal. A lot of people didn't like social media. A lot of people thought it was silly, but of course those who got in on it early and used it properly ended up grabbing a huge amount of power for themselves and creating the ability to influence culture in profound ways going forward in the future. The smartphone, after that came, we all thought that it was silly that we would use one of these, but now we all use smartphones. You're probably listening to this on a smartphone. Smartphones became a huge way that we interact with the world. Even 40 years ago, I'm sure the way that people operated was probably more wholesome and healthy, but the internet and the smartphones and technology is so super dominant that it is going to monopolize our lives anyway, and it has monopolized our lives. It's influenced everything that we do. Social institutions, dating institutions, everything, the way we consume ideas, the way we understand ourselves, all of this technology has a huge effect on all of this. And so the next sort of iteration, the next thing that's coming is, of course, a virtual reality. Our ability for us to place kind of gauzes or eyeglasses over our face, maybe lenses, contact lenses over our eyes, that will create virtual worlds for us to interact with. You've probably seen those headsets you can put on, and you can go deeper into video games and stuff. So instead of you maybe playing a video game staring at a screen, the next level after that is you put on a set of glasses and you're actually in the video game and you're running around, and it's like playing the Wii or something like this. And this phenomenon can be applied to almost anything. It creates a more immersive experience to go from the screen to immersing yourself in the reality using virtual reality. And of course, with video games, it's a very obvious way that this can work. Instead of you sitting down and playing Call of Duty or FIFA or whatever it is you play, Final Fantasy, I'm making myself out to be a boomer here, World of Warcraft maybe on your screen, with your boys, instead you can actually go and put on a head gauze, and then you can be there together. You can all be there together in this space and actually run around and do stuff together. So you're sort of meeting each other in this other world where you play a video game. It's like a different universe. You could call it the Metaverse, as they say. This is going to start influencing us in thousands of different ways, because what has happened in the last 2 years? You've been under house arrest in your house, and so you've sat down and you've started to work by going on Zoom. And instead of you being in the meeting room that you used to be in 4 years ago, where your boss would come in and you'd all have to meet at the same time and in the same place, what happens now is that everybody says be on Zoom at this certain time, and everybody pops into and looks at the screen, and there's the video chats of all the screens, and that's pretty cool. But the next interesting thing is that you can recreate that presence using something like the Metaverse. So you could all put on these gauzes, and it's almost like Avatar. Do you ever see the film Avatar or The Matrix? Ooh. You could get one of those and put on these gauzes, put on these things, and enter into the Metaverse, the Matrix, or the Avatar world, and go to a room in the Avatar world and sit down and have a meeting together. And you can meet your boss, be present in the room, and talk together and use your hands and rearrange ideas and present things. And you could use an avatar for yourself, in order to do this. And that could all be very, very interesting stuff. I find probably the most fascinating thing I find about this is that this is it's almost like the creative mind overcoming reality in an absolute sense. And this is always what technology offers to us. Technology is one of those things that massively empowers these creative types, these people, these idealists. Technology is tied to their ability to conquer the world. The artificial ability for the idealist, dreaming, genius, progressive scientist to overcome the restrictions of the world. That's the sort of Promethean ethos inherent within science and technology and creativity in this regard. And it's getting so extreme, this Promethean ethos of science, that it's now presenting to us a tool that can defeat reality itself, to the point where we can actually go into this headspace and literally do the process of astral projection, which is something that is so similar to the deep personal skill that a creative person has, the ability for you to imagine very strong vistas in your head, or even astrally project and imagine yourself in distant pasts or in other places at the same time, and empathize very deeply with people because you can enter into their entire consciousness and soul and see out their own eyes and stuff like this. Something that was reserved for you and sort of made you feel isolated is now coming to a point where technology can gift that experience to people without them having maybe the mental faculties for it at all. And in some sense, you are getting this ability to revolt against reality entirely by entering into these metaverses, these digital spaces where you can escape fully and go into them and live in them and communicate with people in them and present yourself in them in whatever type of avatar you want. What happens with astral projection is you sit down and you imagine maybe they call it a light body, and then you go and you use that light body to travel off to somewhere else, and then you have to come back to your own body. It's like with when you dream, it's the same sort of kind of concept. And what's happening now with technology in the metaverse is it's like we're creating the astral plane to allow people to dream en masse, because of course we already do that a little bit with stuff like the internet. It's the projection of our thoughts into a global collective consciousness, which is sort of already there in the meat world, in the real world, but this is sort of formalizing it as a technological thing. And the metaverse is then the next step after that, where you can actually enter into that as a character and go into it in an absolute sense, which is absolutely fascinating. It's like a revolt of the creatives and the idealists against the real world. Now, of course, something that a lot of people are picking up on, which is quite fascinating, is that this might not be a good thing. This is the predicate, the prequel for the Matrix. We're now living through, the couple of steps before the Matrix films, and we're experiencing how it all ended up in the Matrix and all this. And I'd say the reason why that is precisely because of the danger or the problems that many of these things offer to us in terms of individuating as people. Technology empowered us immensely to use our brains and gain access to information, but the more technology empowers us, that when we got guns, we no longer had to be muscly, skilled sword fighters, and the quality of the individual soldier went down in terms of competence because technology empowered them so much to be able to kill from a distance, to kill in different ways. And this is a very, very important thing to understand, is that as the more powerful technology grows, the less demands are placed upon the individual to master reality. And so when this metaverse comes along, it's almost like the need for the individual to shape himself becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And this has very serious problems, because the consequences, the restrictions that reality places upon you have huge benefits towards your psychology, towards your mind. When, for example, the soldier in the past had to learn humility and discipline and technique and skill and bravery and courage in order to sword fight one-on-one with someone else, all those mental virtues will turn him into an incredible man, but they don't quite get the same things off a modern soldier. A modern soldier certainly has to learn those virtues, but not maybe to the same level, nor with the same depth, nor with the same comprehensiveness. It's now a different game, if you want to put it this way. It doesn't demand as much emotional transformation that would happen. This is why back in the past, warriors were incredibly prestigious, and nowadays soldiers are treated as discarded, because, you know, anybody can be a soldier. It's just about a little bit of training to hold a gun, and you can churn in a new soldier quite quickly. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it's more of a kind of blunt reality about the dignity of the job has lost its punch because of these sort of scale problems that happen. Technology allows us to scale individuals but reduce the quality of them, absolutely, and this has happened in all industries, not just in soldiers. So this is a fascinating problem, because technology is now going to lead us towards something like the metaverse, where we can create the astral plane, we can create this ideal world. It's like we're creating Plato's Platonic ideal world, where we can go into it in a total sense and have incredible abilities to escape reality. And think about that, because this means we don't have to confront reality. We don't ever have to be broken and humbled, so that we embrace reality and integrate reality and become part of reality properly, and develop the virtues that are imposed upon us, such as patience and restriction and humility, that are necessary to make that process happen. Because we escape reality, we can't individuate fully, or our individuation is going to become more and more difficult to do properly, more and more subtle in the way that it manifests. For me, for example, with that process I described with Jordan Peterson, it was a huge deal for me to experience that, but I'm not sure if I could have had it that way if I was able to go to a metaverse. And I had this, you know, it's like the Jungian model of the mind, you know. I had this problem where I had a neurotic persona, which was an identification with Jeff Buckley, and I wanted to become this neurotic persona. And of course, my ego was attached up into this. And of course, Steph, my true self down here, which would have filled me with animating energy, my soul, my anima, if I broke my ego and broke my persona and crashed that open and dove down into my shadow, which was the humility and patience that I needed, and allowed myself to embrace my animating truth, which is my reality, allowed my anima to show me myself, and then allowed my anima to possess me and give me creative energy so I could speak from my original soul and be myself, if you want to put it this way, and then allow myself to express myself and confronting the shadow and doing that hero's journey, and then reconstructing a well-aligned ego that's properly aligned with myself, so that I can project a congruent persona out into the world. That's a complete process of destruction, self-transformation, reconstruction, and coming back out. That's the Jungian process achieved by me, how I experienced it. Everybody will experience differently. But how can that happen now if we get something like a metaverse where everybody starts going into the metaverse to do work, and we choose these identities, you know? And you think about this in the context of an awful lot of stuff that's happening now in the culture. Jordan Peterson having trouble with pronouns. Like, what's going on there? Well, people are creating identities for themselves. And of course, the argument is, why do you think you can just create an identity? Why do you think that's a good thing for you to just create an identity, a new gender, a new being, a new anything? I know it feels free to be able to create your own identity, and it feels maybe empowering because I've been through it. I know it is. It is empowering to say, I don't have to be this pathetic, limited vocal range that I have. I don't have to be this person I don't like, who is Steph. I can be Jeff Buckley. I can idealize myself. I can create a new identity and escape into that. Why do you think that's a good thing? Are you sure that's a good thing? Because it takes from you something you don't see, which is this whole profound process, this hero's journey that I had to go through, this individuation process that I had to go through. It's refusal to face the shadow. It's refusal to even start the process. And And why do you think that you can do this? But of course, our culture is drifting more and more towards empowering that precisely and saying you literally can be anything. We're going to create a whole new world that you can go into and plug yourself into and become whatever you want. And that's okay. And that empowers you in an immense way. Will empower your imagination to reimagine yourself in the most perfect way you possibly can. But it's going to have serious problems, I promise you. And this is something maybe not to counter signal it, but just to warn against and say these are the type of things we'll have to think about to mitigate against it, because it is coming, but we need to learn how to use it properly. We need to learn how to humanize it and integrate with it properly in order for it to be function properly. Because if we go in and we have the problems with people like me who hate themselves, who have problems with the embodied world, who have problems with the restrictions of reality, projecting a neurotic psychological persona, an idealized imagination of themselves, which is they're incorrectly pursuing. They're refusing to acknowledge what they are and going after this. Like me and Jeff Buckley. Imagine you give me the metaverse, I become Jeff Buckley, and I essentially get this ability to leave Steph and leave my body and deny myself absolutely, and go into this metaverse and demand everybody recognizes me as Jeff Buckley, maybe even empower me to come across like Jeff Buckley, and I go and I live a fake reality as acting like Jeff Buckley. I'm someone else. I never develop an original consciousness. I never contribute anything original. I never develop anything authentic or true. I never represent my anima or my muse or myself. I become a sort of shallow NPC, a half man, an imitation of something that came before. Not a real person, I'm not a real person. I'm a projection of something I admired, an ideal, a delusion, if you want to put it this way, a shadow, ironically. And this is very, very dangerous, and people do this all the time. They are doing this an awful lot now in the modern culture. What happens when we start to create these metaverses and give people the power to completely escape? To say reality is tyrannical. Us creative, like I'm a creative, open-minded person. I've been oppressed my whole life. I've had all these terrible things happen to me, and now I get to escape reality fully. I get to get out of this fucking place completely and turn around to all you and say, fuck you. I can go in and use NFTs and crypto and become a millionaire in this magic metaverse and all this type of stuff. And I can be happy and no one can hold me back anymore. And I can be free and no one can tell me what I am. I can define what I am absolutely. And it feels empowering and it feels like the ultimate fuck you towards the world and fuck you to all those realists who held you down. But it's not necessarily empowering in the way that you think. It liberates your ego. It liberates your persona. But will it really give you that gift of discovering what you truly are? And this is going to be the crux of the problem. I guarantee you, I can see it already. I can see it hitting right now. This will be the challenge. These things already exist profoundly in the social media age. People's personas personify them. Clearly I don't have the intellect to be using language. Their personas personify them, but they don't have a grounded identity. They have struggled with the real world, the things that are happening with all this. Now, in order to add another layer of illustration to this, I actually had a profound experience during that Jordan Peterson phase, where he got me to be humble. I started to go to teach English in a coffee shop and give up on my silly dreams, and I started to say, right, I've got to stop trying to be a musician like Jeff Buckley. I've got to start embracing what I actually am. And my animate imagination. And so I started doing dream reading, like Jung said, and some crazy things began to happen that weirdly predicated this. It was almost like a myth of the modern age. And I'm going to play you another video. Here's some egotistical narcissism coming in. I'm going to play you another video of me talking about this on a different channel, on a podcast I did recently on Break the Rules. And I want you to listen to this story that came out of me from reading my dreams that was related to this precise phenomenon that I didn't really understand at the time, but seems like it's manifesting more and more. There's lots. So years ago, I was reading Jung, and I was more reading Jung trying to find out practical stuff that I could get out of him. As I said before, I would have that like highly tilted creative mind. I would be high in openness and just genuinely always dreaming and thinking about this stuff. And so, but it'd also be somewhat cynical. Like I'd be a little bit kind of blunt realist, and I wouldn't sit there and just read through Jung for a theoretical sake. Like I'd always go in and be like, where can I get something that's practical and real out of this? And so I was always very, very honed in on procedures. I was very much a more procedure than a theory guy. And Jung's hardly like, the most grounded stuff ever. So it's like you have to really dig. I found the idea of dream reading, and he said something along the lines of like, you can individuate your dream reading. I had no idea what individuation was, but I said I'd do the dream reading thing. So what I did is I sat down And I actually fucking went for it. I like recorded 200 of my dreams and did it the way that he said. And so what he said you do is you sort of take the dreams and then you look at the dreams and you cross analyze them and try to find meta patterns within the dreams, super patterns within the dreams. So it's almost like you can imagine you've got a load of Hollywood guys producing films in your head every night. And then you're supposed to take all these films and cross analyze the films and diagnose the society that the films came out of as a consequence of this. And so you're looking for the themes, you know, what does Superman represent in the Marvel universe? What does the hero represent in the Marvel universe? What's the good guy? What's the bad guy? What is Thanos? All this type of stuff. You do this sort of with your own dreams. So I did it, and loads of things came up. Loads of really fascinating things came up. And I think the most fascinating thing of all is that there was a distinct order to them. Like, these things were definitely talking in their own way. That's probably the thing that floored me the most, is that over the course of several dreams, they would almost do like a little movie series, and you'd get ones that would sort of string together in a strange way. It's very surreal. Now, a lot of it sometimes was a little bit chaotic and crazy and hard to make sense of it all, and you're like, what the fuck am I doing? But other parts of it were very, very contingent and coherent. And out of that came certain ideas, certain really, really big theses kind of popped out of that. And it taught me to think in a way that's I didn't have before. It was like I learned how to think in pictures properly for the first time in my life. And it's surreal how strange you can think then. It's almost like you think quicker when you can do this. I don't know how to describe it, but it was a phenomenal thing. And out of that came, I was trying to turn it on to a big story. And the big story, it's, you know, when you're making a big story, you always want to find a villain. And so the problem I had is like, all right, how do I find a villain? What do I do? So I took all the dreams and I tried to look for the negative, shadowy characters and aspects in all the dreams, and I started to take out all their little pieces, and you'd have, like, you know, spindly spider hands in one and a giant spider in another, and you'd have did you ever hear of Eric Scissorhands in another one, and you'd have these beasts that live inside your dreams, and aliens, the alien stuff like this. And I took them all and cross analyzed them and turned them into this meta character I called Makina. Later I talked to Meme Analysis, and he brings up digital anima, and it's like the same archetype, if you want to put it this way. I come up with this idea, and I sit down and I'm like looking at this. This is just the weirdest stuff to do. Like, it's pretty surreal, but this is the type of shit I was up to, and it was really working for me. And I sit down and I look at this, and it's almost like this thing is alive. It's like when you read a really good book and a character is well written and it explodes in your imagination and you can't stop thinking about the character. It's just such a big idea. So this was like this. I was thinking about this fucking spidery, effeminate monster being that lived in the astral plane and haunted everybody through their dreams all the time. And this character lived in everybody's dreams. And I started to realize that this character was like some way tangentially related to Satan, and she was stuck in the astral plane, and she was trying to get out of the astral plane and get into all the people inside my story. And then it was almost like a parasite, worm her way inside the minds of the people. She'd get into dreams of the people and possess them with ideas and make them change reality in order to create her desire or something like this. And she was actually trying to eat them, is what I realized. So she was trying to dive into reality, possess people full of their dreams, and drag them towards a plan. Now, this plan was she wanted to build a spaceship in the future, right? And what she was going to do with this spaceship, she was going to fill everybody's ideas with a dream of escaping reality, right? And she was going to fill everybody's ideas with this feeling inside of them that evil and suffering and violence and pain is wrong and evil and it shouldn't exist. And she's going to, if they are going to go to build this future, do this thing, do this great project where they build this beautiful machine, and they'll all line up at the end of it. And it's like, do you know the UFO myth? They'll walk into the machine and their consciousness will be uploaded, and it will be heaven, and they'll all zap themselves into it. And so what happens is that happens. Everybody like builds, they reorganize society to create this beautiful machine where they create a thing that everybody walks into where there's no pain and no suffering ever again. And it's like this heaven thing. And they all line up and they step into it and they walk into it one by one by one by one. And I'm like, you know, like seeing this in my head. And as they all walk into it, they all zap up. And out of just when the last person goes in, all of a sudden it all changes and this like dark feeling comes over it. You realize, oh my God, they just built Makina, and then they built a spider, and they walked into the spider's mouth. The spider ate them and digested them, and then it gave birth to her, which was sort of the Antichrist. It gave birth to the bad guy, and then the sort of dream story stopped there. And I was like, oh my God, what the fuck? Like, that's so strange, and it stuck in my head for ages, like a little myth. It's like a little Greek myth that popped out of my head, and And I for like a couple of years then afterwards, this was like years ago, I would start to notice this is like you know, a little bit schizo, but I'd noticed that I was like, people are actually possessed by Machina in ways, because you can see it from the way they talk almost like there's this naive hate for the violent real world. Now I'd see it particularly in tech people. I found it very surreal.
Yeah.
This is blending this weird dream project I was doing in reality. And so I talked to people who were big into Silicon Valley. I talked to all sorts of things. And I talked to them, and they'd say stuff to me like, you know, the world is evil. It's like Gnosticism, but in their own way. The world is evil, and the suffering and inequality in the world doesn't need to be here. Like, we'll figure out technology that will get rid of this, and we'll figure out a way to get rid of violence, and we'll figure out a way to get rid of unfairness. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a reality, a realm where pure compassion can happen between us. We can all experience each other as
it's an algorithm to crack.
Pure perfect beings, and we'll get rid of the reality problem, because reality is where all the evil happens. And in fact, the body is probably the most grounded and serious problem, because in the body you have all the limitations. You have inequality in, you know, how muscly you are and how handsome you are.
Wants and
it's all in the body. All your passions and the desires is in the body, and the body is the obstacle, and the mind, the being of light that you are, is in here, and this is trying to escape. And so what we'll do is we'll make tech that, first of all, society is going to get reorganized, so they all talk about that, but then it gets more extreme. They talk about virtual reality. They talk about creating these machines that we go into, and I'm sitting here and I'm being like, what the fuck? This is like the story from my dreams. Why are people talking like this? And they say, yeah, we're going to make this realm that we'll go into, and it will allow you to lift your spirit out of the world, and eventually you'll upload your consciousness into it, and then you'll escape the pain of life. You'll escape the problems of life, and evil will be defeated forever, and we'll all enter the kingdom of heaven. And then what I started to see is like, it's Christianity actually, because it's like the same, it's a sort of shadow Christianity, because it's like the same myth as the rapture. It's the same story. The world is fallen, and at the end of time we will all be lifted up into the kingdom of heaven. And then what I started to notice, this is once I started to realize this, I realized that what happens in Christianity is the good people get taken up into the kingdom of heaven, but the bad people go into the lake of fire. And I started to see this as well. The people in the tech world would say those who are not on board are part of the problem. They're part of evil. They're the bad people, and they need to be cast out. They need to be pushed out of this, and they need to be ended and destroyed. They need to be got rid of. They need to be cast into the lake of fire. They're the demons. They're the demons holding us down in this Gnostic prison. They're members of the demiurge, and we need to escape this and go to this. What we're going to do is we're going to build this great machine that will set us free, and we're going to code it with our values and our desires for equality and compassion and ever living ability to be souls of light that we can all live inside of, and we're all going to charge towards it. And I was like, all right, this is starting to get a bit surreal, like talking to these people and all this type of stuff. And so I kind of like step back from it a bit, but all of a sudden then Mark Zuckerberg, our most favorite guy who runs Facebook, drops down there a couple of days ago and says, yo guys, I just built a machine that we can all enter into, and we can be whoever we want inside of it, and there'll be we'll be able to go all across the world all at the same time and do whatever we want. And I don't know, guys, I don't know, maybe I've been drinking, maybe the Irishman's been drinking too much whiskey.
A lot of these movements end up going into this very childlike state, as opposed to being a little bit more sophisticated, let's say.
Again, this is so surreal. Like I don't know actually how to describe how strange this was. But so then I'm giving away, like, this is definitely, I'm gonna have to turn this into a film at some point. But then what happened was I was keep on working with this problem, because obviously you want to be a hero to work through this thing where you're fighting against Machina. And so I started to come across this problem where I was trying to figure out how I can beat her. So I had to like run down into the underworld and defeat this Antichrist entity that had now been born. And this is my little like fucking boyo quest, if you want to put it this way. And eventually, like, you know, you do all the rigmarole and you confront her and you get her, and I attack her, and I get this axe and I crack her in half, and it splits open her chest. She's like the Antichrist thing, whatever it is. I split open its chest. The spider like cracks in half and opens up, and it's destroyed. And what was inside Machina was a wounded child, frozen in time, crying because he had been hurt. He was stuck. It was the pain of life had struck Machina long ago and hurt her. And so she had built this callous, this exoskeleton of manipulations and machinations in order to manage and control and solve the riddle of the world. And I didn't think much. I didn't know what to make of it, but it hit me as really profound at the time. But as I started getting to therapy later in my life, I started to see something absolutely fucking surreal. When you're working with someone who's got a problem with, did you ever hear about the child abuse thing? The world, The Shining. Did you ever hear about that?
Yeah.
The reason why it's because when you abuse a kid, this is dark shit, but like when you abuse a kid, it causes them to change. It does something to them. They gain the ability to shine. Now, this is actually like very, very grounded and well studied, that when a kid gets traumatized in whatever facility that will be, they're more likely to be, for example, creative. Because what happens is when something bad happens to you, you need to use your imagination to figure out what to do. And your imagination is geared, your right hemisphere, imagination, whatever it is, it's geared more towards chaos. And so by hurting something, you switch on its innovation in some sense. You make it shine. You switch on its more higher capacities and higher powers. And when something bad happens to you, when you get traumatized, you begin to machinate. You begin to try figure out how to solve the problem. When you're in pain, when you're suffering, you try to find a reason for why you suffer. Nietzsche talked about this. It's with a why you can overcome any how. Like what's the cause of your suffering? To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. And so the most basic problem of life is suffering. This is what Buddha and all them would say. And we get traumatized all the time by reality. It's like it's literally like hell in many ways. And in this state of suffering, your mind begins to whiz. It begins to say to itself, why? What's happening? What's going on? You rationalize and you craft, and you can do stuff where you recreate yourself. You can machinate and reimagine and reshape yourself and create a whole new reality in your head. This is exactly what Makina did. She created a whole new reality and sucked everyone into it and ate them. This is what people do. When we are in pain with the world around us, we create a whole new reality. We build these whole new tech machines based on values that we'd like the world to operate, based on the principle, the neocon geo universal principles that he wants, the algorithm that he plugs into this reality. So we can go into those. So everybody's safe, and there's always compassion, and there's always all these type of things. And this is fascinating. Then when you talk to these people, they're hyper animated, and they actually have an animus against reality. They say, fuck reality. We're going to reshape. We're going to use tech to overcome reality. Do you know what that sounds like? That sounds like Lucifer. That sounds like Lucifer breaking free from God and says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. We're going to overcome reality. We're going to create our new craft, our new vision, our new world. What happens then is that you have all these opportunities to recreate a world, escape into a different world. And over time, you begin to try to escape and maybe even leave the old world that you were. So this is what happens with trauma-based mind control and schizophrenia. You can actually you can go in, you can sit someone down, and you can talk to them and get them in a headspace, and you can begin to hurt them until they start to create a alternate personality in order to deal with the pain, to create a separate personality. And then you can start to separate them out, like you're splitting a bubble. And then you have two personalities. And the theory goes that the second personality would be activated by a certain, like you'd maybe electrocute them or something like that. And then the second personality would be activated, and they could be an assassin or something like this. So this person could go around being a normal person, and then you electrocute them, and then boom, they turn into the assassin, like Derek Zoolander did, and stuff like this. And this is like, this is real. Like you traumatize someone, and this is where a lot of psychosis and schizophrenia and problems come from. It's deep down at the very bottom of it. Something happened to you that made you try to understand yourself in a different way, to recreate yourself. But it's almost like you're like an egg that tried to split. You couldn't do it properly. And so it's like you're caught between two worlds. Maybe because it's a false world you're trying to escape into. You're trying to leave your body. It's like your soul's trying to exit your body, and it can't be done. Or maybe it's a thing where you just didn't do it enough, and so you haven't gone into it. And what you see now with the whole metaverse thing is that it's literally like the psychosis of pain, that the psychosis that comes as a consequence of the suffering of reality. People are now literally getting sophisticated enough and explicit enough that they can escape into it. And what they're trying to be reborn as, think about this, what they're trying to be reborn as is a fucking child. They want a new beginning. That's what a child is. They want to reimagine themselves as a fresh start so they can go through it all again. The precise problem is the wounded experience they had as a child. To be traumatized as a child is such a problem. And now they're going through the full cycle in order to claim redemption over it. The same way as when you have a kid, often it can be very healing for a lot of parents to have a kid, and sometimes because it justifies their lives in a way. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily healthy, but it can certainly have that effect because it's like the creation of new life and a justification for the struggles they went through. So you can make of all that what you will, but the premises that were revealed to me in that mythos, in that story, they've served me very well. Like, I've seen these patterns constantly be operant, and the world has moved more and more towards this, as I've already said. And I don't know what to make of this stuff. I will say that this metaverse is going to empower the creatives to have a revolution against reality. It's going to empower the idealists to overcome the restrictions of the real world. You can even look at the theses among crypto and the metaverse and stuff like this as a sort of challenge towards the establishment, and to say, fuck you, I'm not going to do what you told me, and I'm going to go build an alternate reality that I'm going to participate in. I'm going to build a new world that I can just go into instead of having to fight you in this world. And there's some interesting problems, but also interesting solutions. It's just very, very fascinating altogether. Human history is beyond belief in many different ways, and how we are supposed to interact with this is hard to know. I can say for certain that these things are coming, and it's important that we establish ourselves within them, or establish a good relationship with them. We can't deny them usually. Maybe we could go Amish mode. Maybe we're getting to the point now where it's like, all right, let's go Amish mode. This has been too much. I'm out of here. I'm not going into the Matrix, guys. Like, I'm done. The smartphone was manageable because I could, put it away and stuff, but I'm not going into the Matrix. It's done. Maybe that's the response. Maybe that's the way you're supposed to go. But I would always tilt with the idea that these things are going to happen, and it's a challenge which you must integrate these very complicated tools and learn how to use them properly and match them towards yourself. And I think the responsibility of us creatives, the responsibility of you and I, us people with these blisteringly open minds, who usually can grapple these things first and establish the most interesting approaches towards them, maybe establish the standards towards them, is that
So I'm going to launch right into it. I like this story as well. This is the story of Noah and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel, which I think are juxtaposed very interestingly. The Tower of Babel is one of those stories like Cain and Abel that's only a few lines long. It's like a fragment in some sense, although the story of Noah is quite a well-developed narrative. But like the other stories that we've covered, it is relevant at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so what I'm going to do to begin with is to start with some background information, so some psychological background information, so that the story makes sense. And the first thing that I'd like to make a case for is that you bring to bear on the world an a priori perceptual structure. And that's really an embodied structure, and it's a consequence of the 3.5 billion years that you've spent putting your body together, which is a tremendous amount of time. And not only your body, but your mind, of course, because your mind is part of your body and very much embedded within it. You tend to think that you have your brain in your head and it's sort of floating separate from the rest of your body, but it's not really true. You're a tremendous, massive system of neurons running through your entire body, autonomic. There's more neurons in the autonomic nervous system than there are in the central nervous system, so that's a lot of neurons. And then your central nervous system, of course, enables you to exercise voluntary control over your musculature and also to receive information from it. Your brain is really distributed through your body. One of the things you may not know is that people who are paraplegic can walk if you suspend them above a treadmill. Their legs will walk by themselves with no voluntary control. So your spine is capable of quite complex activity. In fact, when you walk, mostly it's a controlled fall, and mostly your spine is doing it. And so anyways, the point of all that is that you don't have a blank slate consciousness that's interpreting a world that manifests itself as segregated objects in some straightforward sense. You have a built-in interpretive system that's extraordinarily deeply embedded and invisible, because you might think about it as the implicit structure of your unconscious. It's what gives rise to your conscious experience, and it presents you with the world. That's one way of thinking about it. And it's a good way of thinking about it. It's the psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, as well as the neuroscientific way of thinking about it, because one of the things that's pretty interesting about modern neuroscientists, especially the top-rate ones, and those are usually the ones that are working on emotions, as far as I've been able to tell, are often quite enamored of the psychoanalysts. Jaak Panksepp was a good example of that, because they came to understand that the psychoanalysts' insistence on underlying unconscious personified motivations was actually an accurate reflection of how the brain worked. And so to think of yourself as a loose collection of autonomous spirits that's governed by some overarching identity is a reasonable way of thinking about it. The question is, or a question that arises from that is, what is the nature of this a priori structure that you use to interpret the world? And I think the clearest answer to that is that it's a story, that you live inside a story. And that's very, very interesting to me, because I believe, and I have a couple of videos that lay this out, I believe that Darwinian presuppositions are at least as fundamental as Newtonian presuppositions. I actually think they're more fundamental, and that the fact that we've evolved story-like structures through which to interpret the world indicates to me that there's something deeply true about story-like structures. Or they're true at least insofar as the fact that we've developed them means that here we are living, and that it's taken 3.5 billion years to develop them. They're highly functional. And so we don't have much better definition of truth than highly functional. You know, that's about as good as it gets, partly because we're limited creatures and we don't have omniscient knowledge, and so the best we can do with our knowledge, generally speaking, is to note its functionality and improve it when it fails to work properly. I think the scientific method actually does that. And so the fact that we've evolved a story-like structure through which to interpret the world, that's pretty damn interesting. It says something fundamental about stories, and it's strange in the same way that the fact that we have hemispheric specialization for the known and the unknown, or for chaos and order and chaos, respectively, also says something fundamental about the nature of the world. If you assume that, you know, we've evolved to reflect the structure of the world, broadly speaking, and that's obviously not just the physical structure, the atoms and the molecules, but all of the patterned manifestations of the physical molecules as they build structures of increasing complexity across time. That would include human interactions and political interactions, economic interactions, familial interactions, all of those things that are a very important part of our reality, but perhaps in some sense not as fundamental as the physical attributes that the physicists concentrate on. So we live in stories. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about stories and about their structure, because when you understand a little bit about the structure of stories, then a whole array of things about mythology all of a sudden make overwhelming sense. And it's so useful, because what you see is that many of the things that are standard occurrences in your life, everyone's life, are portrayed universally in mythology. And it's very helpful because, first of all, it de-isolates you. One of the things you learn as a clinical psychologist, contra the anti-psychiatrists, let's say, is that diagnosis is often a relief to people. You know, there's a problem with being diagnosed, because then you might be labeled, and then the label can follow you for the rest of your life. And once you're labeled as something, then strange things happen around you that often reinforce that label. Maybe you start acting it out more, or you adopt it as an identity. But there's a flip side of that, which is that the last thing that you ever want to hear when you go see a physician or a psychologist is, you know, I've never seen a case like yours before. Right, that is not a relief, man, because if the message is, I've never heard anything like what you're telling me, the outcome is either going to be not so good for you, or you're not going to get listened to at all, right? Because you're such an anomaly that your existence is annoying to the integrated knowledge structure of the medical professional that you're attempting to receive advice from. Well, it's definitely the case, because, you know, if you can be put in a box, then the box tells the doctor what to do with you, and that's actually a relief to the doctor. but also a relief to you, right? Because you want to know. So you come and you say, look, I can't go out of my house much anymore. I'm afraid on elevators. I have heart palpitations, and sometimes I end up in the emergency room. Increasingly, my interactions in the world are restricted. I find myself staying at home. I'm afraid I'm going to die of a heart attack. And the psychologist says, well, you have agoraphobia. And it's like lots of people have that. And here's usually how it develops, and here's the treatment course. And, we can probably do something about that. And it's like, well, you're not going to die of a heart attack now, probably. That's a real relief. You're not crazy in a completely unique way, and you're crazy in a way that might be treatable, and it's such a relief, because people come in there with a pile of snakes of indeterminate magnitude, and they walk out with one manageable snake, and it's still a snake, but one manageable snake beats a Hydra, right? So, all right, so back to stories. So the stories that we tell and that we live in are fundamentally ways that we deal with the complexity of the world. And the fundamental problem with the world, as far as I can tell, is that not only is it complex beyond your comprehension, but the complexity shifts in unpredictable ways. So that's the Darwinian conundrum, actually. That's why Darwinism seems to be a practical necessity with regards to the continuation of life, because the complexity changes unpredictably, you can't necessarily tell what's going to work in the future. And so the Darwinian process solves that by generating quasi-random variations and letting whichever one by happenstance happens to work in that environment survive. Now, it's not random precisely, because the underlying structure is conserved. It's very rare that a child would be born with an extra arm or something like that. And like the skeletal structure that you inhabit is shared by animals going way, way back in evolutionary history. There's a lot of conservation in the evolutionary process, so there's variation within conservation. Like music, it's a good way of thinking about it. So the stories that we tell have exactly the same structure. They have this core element with variations. And so, all right, I'll turn to the stories. And so the first problem, as I mentioned, is a complexity problem. Things are just too complicated to get a handle on. And that actually has serious consequences, because what happens to everyone eventually is that their lives become so complicated that they die. So, and many terrible things can happen to you on the way to dying as well that are complexity related, right? You can develop a serious illness that you can't get a handle on. You can hit what would you call an impasse in your relationship that you cannot get past and see no way out of. That happens to people quite frequently. People who are suicidal, for example, they often feel like they've been backed into a corner, that they have no options. They have no good options. No matter which way they turn, there's something terrible to face, and they can't see any way out of it. And sometimes that's more true than you'd like to think, because we also tend to like to think that people's problems are primarily psychological, but they're not. And that's one thing you learn quite rapidly as a clinician, is that most of the time people don't come to you because they have mental illness. They come to you because they have a complexity management problem. Their lives have got out of hand on them, and they don't know how to get them back under control. And so all sorts of things can do that. And then, of course, that can make you anxious or depressed. It can trigger all sorts of illnesses. But the fundamental problem is still that things have got beyond you. And that actually has a psychophysiological cost that isn't merely psychological. You have a limited amount of capacity from a resource perspective to deal with emergent complexity. There's just not enough of you. You'll exhaust your psychophysiological resources if you get into a situation that's too complex. Well, that's what the idea of chaos represents. It represents that underlying complexity that can manifest itself at any time. And it can manifest itself, for example, if you wake up in the morning and you feel an ache of some sort, and perhaps it's nothing, and You ignore it, but it gets worse, and you end up going to the hospital, and you find out, perhaps, for example, that you have pancreatic cancer, and you're going to live for 6 months, and that's the end of that. And so it's at that moment that you break through the thin ice that everyone walks on, and you see what's underneath. And what's underneath is the ineradicable complexity of life. And that's chaos. And now, it's taken people a long, long time to get a grip on this conceptual, what would you call it? Conceptual schema. And human beings have done it mostly with image and story before they've been able to do it in any articulated manner. And so there are a set of images that represent this underlying chaos. And one of them is the dragon of chaos, precisely that. And that's the dragon that the hero goes out to confront. That's the symbol of the unknown. It's the thing that lurks underneath. It's the thing that also guards treasure, because in the unknown there's possibility. Also the water that was there that we talked about in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the water that's there at the beginning, both the salt and the fresh water, is often a symbol of pre-cosmogonic chaos. Often people have dreams, for example. Some of you have had this dream, I suspect. You'll dream that you're in a house that you know well, and all of a sudden you discover a new room or a set of new rooms, or maybe a set of rooms in the basement. And often the rooms are not well organized, and they're full of water. Those are very common things. And what that means is that you've broken through the constraints of your conscious self-understanding to a new domain of possibility, but a new domain that needs a tremendous amount of work. It says, well, here's a new part of you, but it's not well developed. It's flooded. It's flooded with chaos, essentially. And it's water, I think, partly because chaos is not only what you fall into when you're not expecting it, but it's also the unknown that you confront forthrightly and generate new things out of. And water is a symbol of life, especially in the desert. And of course, life is dependent on water. And so water is a natural symbol to utilize when you're talking about something that's life-giving but also potentially deadly. Because a little bit of water, well, that's a drink, but a lot of water, that's a shipwreck, right? And so, and those are the extremes. Now, there are accounts that are sort of subtexts in Genesis and elsewhere in the Old Testament of God conquering a great monster, Leviathan, or Behemoth, that has these sort of serpentile elements, and making the world as a consequence of that conflict. So there's this idea that the world-creating force, which we've talked about as the Logos, is the thing that continually confronts chaos, and that one way of thinking about chaos is as a predatory reptilian monster, and often one that lives in the depths or perhaps underwater. And part of that, I think, is because we actually use our predator detection circuit to do this sort of precognitive processing. And so the notion fundamentally is anything that threatens you instantaneously is something that your predator detection circuit should be working with. It's fast. It's fast. It's low resolution. It doesn't have a lot of ideas, but it's really, really fast. And that also accounts for our capability and tendency to very rapidly treat people who upset our conceptual structures as enemies of the predatory variety. We can fall into that in no time flat, because it's the archetype. If something comes along to knock you for a loop, it's a shark. It's something that lurks under the water. It's something that'll pull you down. It's an enemy. And you should get prepared. And that's a reasonable defensive strategy, even though it also has its dangers and can sometimes be wrong. So the landscape within which we have to erect our stories is fundamentally one of an overarching chaos, a chaos that exceeds our capacity to comprehend in any sense, individually, familial, socially, economically. We're always threatened by the collapse of the structures that we inhabit constantly. We have to work. Well, it's like you own a house, you know. How much time do you spend maintaining a house? Well, a lot. And why is that? It's because the house falls apart because you're stupid, and the house falls apart, well, because you do repairs wrong or you ignore things, right? And I'm saying this actually for technical reasons. The house falls apart because you're incompetent. But even if you're competent, the house falls apart, right? It's just entropy, and so things have a proclivity to fall apart on their own, so you just have to run like mad just to keep them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then, of course, that is complicated by your own willful blindness and inadequacy as a repair person and refusal to attend and all those other things. And that's a very classic idea, which we'll return to. One of the ideas that Mircea Eliade, famous historian of religions, extracted from a very large corpus of flood myths was the idea that the earth is periodically flooded for two reasons. One is things fall apart. Just entropy. It's straight entropy. I don't remember which law of thermodynamics that is, but it's one of the big laws of thermodynamics. It's one of the top three, man. Things fall apart of their own accord. And that's one of the things that we have to contend with. And then the rate at which things fall apart is sped by the sins of men. That's the other idea. And you know that. Everyone knows that because you know, your car breaks down on the highway and you think, God, that's so inconvenient. And then you shake your fist at the sky, and then there's part of you in the back of your mind that goes, God, I knew that rattle that I wasn't paying attention to actually signified something, and I knew I should have paid attention to it, and I didn't, and now I'm in the situation that I'm in now. And I bet you this happens to people 2 or 3 times a week, is they do something stupid that they know they shouldn't have done, that they told themselves not to do mere seconds before. And they know, the voice says, don't do that. Yeah, you do it. You can get nailed for it exactly the way that you knew you would get nailed for it. And then you're hurt doubly because not only did it fall apart, but you're the idiot that made it fall apart, knowing full well that it was going to fall apart and ignoring it. And so that's the idea behind the notion that there are 2 reasons that things fall apart: thermodynamic entropy and the proclivity of people not to attend to things they know they should attend to. And partly we do that because if a problem emerges, it always announces itself, unless it's a really, really tiny problem and you're approaching it voluntarily, it always announces itself with negative emotion. And that's part of the predator detection circuit. It announces itself in frustration or disappointment or emotional pain or grief or the paramount one, anxiety. And no wonder, because it's a problem, right? And one of the logical responses is to sort of freeze in the face of the problem. But of course, if it's a problem that has to be addressed and solved, freezing it and turning away from it is not a good solution, because since things tend to fall apart on their own accord, if you just leave the thing alone that's problematic, it's just going to get worse, not better, which is one of the things that's very annoying about life. So for example, if you get a warning message from the tax department, the probability that ignoring that will make it go away is 0, right? What will happen instead is that the more you ignore it, the larger it will grow. And if you ignore it long enough, then it will turn into something large enough to eat you. And that will be the end of you. And I read in Harper's Magazine at one point that people would rather be mugged than audited. And so I believe that, because the mugging, man, that's over, right? It's like a couple of minutes of sheer terror, loss of your wallet, the way you walk. The audit, that's like a semi-fatal disease. So that's chaos. Now, it's the idea here, too, is that that's the chaos. That's the psychological idea, is that that's also the chaos that whatever is being represented in Genesis as the Spirit of God extracts order out of at the beginning of time. And it's also that which we're constantly contending with as we struggle in the same manner to construct and maintain habitable worlds. So it's brilliant. It's brilliant. When I first put together the relationship between what Eliade called the pre-cosmogonic chaos and the predatory landscape that surrounded our ancestors and the manner in which we're structured neurologically to respond to all of that, I thought it was like an amazing epiphany, because it's self-evidently the case that the world is too complicated for us to deal with, and that's one of the problems that we face on an ongoing basis. And then the question is, well, what do you do about that? And if you ignore it, it gets worse, so ignoring it doesn't work, and so we know what doesn't work, and so if ignoring it doesn't work, then attending to it might work. And then I found out with the Egyptians, for example, that Horus was the god of attention, and the same thing happened among the Mesopotamians with Marduk and his ring of eyes. It's like, what's the way to forestall the catastrophe of things falling apart? And the answer to that is by attending to them, voluntarily attending to them. And that slots very nicely into the hero mythology that promotes the idea that if there's a dragon in the whereabouts, in the neighborhood, let's say, that hiding in the basement just makes it grow larger. It's time to go out and confront the damn thing. And the general stories is, well, you might get killed because it's a dragon, but it's only might as opposed to definitely will get killed if it happens to attack you at 3 a.m. at home when you're hungover and it's been a bad day and you don't have your sword and your shield at the ready, which is generally what happens to people who avoid things. So it's not something that should be recommended. You're screwed both ways. That's one of the things that's so nice about being deeply pessimistic. It's so freeing because one of the things, well, it's very frequent. It's such a relief. And it's really a useful habit to develop is sometimes no matter what you do, you're in trouble. And that's a relief because then you can stop scrabbling around for the way out. There's no way out, man. It's like you can pick murder, wretched death A or slightly less wretched death B, something like that. But, and I know that's a terrible way of looking at things, but it is extraordinarily useful to understand that many times your choice boils down to picking the least bad option. And if that's all you can do, if that's how life is revealing itself to you, it's like, well, more power to you. The least bad option, that's the best you can do. And it's good enough, especially compared to the alternative, which is the most bad option. So, all right, now, so the fundamental reality of things is complexity beyond comprehension. And then the question is, well, how is it that you manage that? And partly you manage that, and this is where the image of the patriarchal order comes in the positive manner, I might point out, because in the absence of patriarchal structure, for lack of a better lexicon, there's nothing but chaos. And I wouldn't recommend chaos because there's a lot of it and there isn't that much of you. And if you think you can handle it without an a priori structure and without a sociological structure surrounding you, then you don't know anything at all about human beings. Because one of the things I've noticed, for example, is that it's unbelievable the degree to which our sanity depends on a functioning sociological structure. And here's why. Well, first of all, you kind of need to know what to do every day. You have to have a routine, because you're an animal, And, if you have a dog or a cat, dogs are a really good example of this. Dogs like routine. They like to be walked the number of times a day that they're supposed to be walked, and they get quite sick very rapidly if you don't routinize their days. Children are exactly the same way. Now, you can overdo it, right? But still, you need to know approximately when you should get up. It should be approximately the same every day. You need to know approximately when you're going to eat. You need to know what you're going to eat. You need to know who you're going to eat with. You need to know where to buy your food. It's like 80% of your life, 70% of your life, something like that, consists of those things that you do every single day, that you repeat. And those are often the things that people think about as the trivial elements of their life. But one of the things I would like to point out to you, if you do the mathematics, I did this with a client of mine who was having a hard time putting his child to bed. They were having a fight every night. And I knew by that time, the studies indicate that most parents only spend 20 minutes per day of one-on-one time with their child. Now, the reason for that is that people are busy, and it's actually not that easy to parse out 20 minutes of one-on-one time. It's a lot bloody more time than you think. But that's all there is, 20 minutes. And he's spending like 40 minutes a day fighting with this kid, trying to get the kid to go to bed. And that's not very entertaining. You think, well, it's just having a scrap with the kid about going to bed. But it's no. If it happens every day, it's a catastrophe. So you do the math. So we'll say 5 hours a week for the sake of argument, just to keep it simple. It's 20 hours a month. It's 240 hours a year. That's 6 40-hour work weeks. So that guy was basically spending a month and a half of work weeks doing absolutely nothing but having a wretched time fighting with his son, trying to get him to go to bed. Horrible, right? That's just way too much time to spend doing something like that if you want to actually have a positive relationship with someone, because it's just too punishing. And so Well, so you need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it, or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, you know. Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. And of course, it rests on an unconscious structure. But the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane if you have a well-organized unconscious and ego is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time, and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just nonstop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other, and we have emotional displays on our face, and we're looking at each other's eyes, and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. And they drift badly because the world is too complicated for you to keep it organized all by yourself. You just cannot do it. So we outsource the problem of sanity. And it's very intelligent that we outsource the problem of sanity, because sanity is an impossibly complex problem. And so the way that we manage the incredibly complex problem is we have a very large number of brains working simultaneously on the problem all the time. It's like a stock market for sanity. And it's partly, and I use that definition with purpose, because the stock market does the same kind of impossible thing, right? Because it tries to price things, which is impossible. How many things are there? Like 1 billion. How in the world do you decide what the price is? You can't decide what the price is. That's why you have a stock market. Well, in a free market, I mean for consumer goods, is everyone's voting on what the price of everything is all the time. And that's the way we figure it out, because it's technically impossible. That's partly why the stock market explodes now and then, and there's bubbles and all that sort of thing. But anyways, the point is, things are chaotic. In Alice in Wonderland, when Alice goes down the rabbit hole, that's the underworld, right? So now she's gone into the substructure of being. And she meets the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is Mother Nature. And Mother Nature is running around yelling, "Off with their heads, off with their heads," which is, of course, what Mother Nature does. And she tells Alice, "In my kingdom, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place." And that's exactly right. And that's a description of, in fact, evolutionary biologists and psychologists have picked up on that phrase. They call it the Red Queen problem. And the Red Queen problem is everything's after you all the time and you're not smart enough to do anything about it or enough about it. And so that's a permanent existential problem. So how do you deal with that? You've got a biological structure. So your embodiment is part of the solution to the problem. And then you're enculturated. And because you're enculturated, you're taught a lot of things that you need to know, but mostly what you're taught is how to communicate with other people in an acceptable manner. And then once you can communicate with people in an acceptable manner, then you can outsource your problems constantly, which you're doing constantly. And so we're in this continual dynamic exchange of problem solving. So if you're a socialized person, that's what you get access to. And that's something to know if you're going to have kids. And I mentioned this, I think, in a previous lecture. The purpose of being a parent for very young children is to make your children exceptionally socially desirable by the age of 4. Because if you can do that, they're set. Because everyone wants them around. And as soon as everybody wants them around, they want to play with them, they want to cooperate with them, they want to compete with them. It's like the door's open, and they stay sane because they've got all sorts of people who actually like them that are helping them out. And so that's your goal, is to make them as socially acceptable as you possibly can, as socially desirable as you possibly can. And that doesn't mean you render them obedient without spirit, right? That's a tyrant's mode of enforcing social acceptability. It's like, never do anything wrong. Well, that's not any way to, I mean, that's a good piece of advice, you know, like, but it's missing the other half, which is do a bunch of things that are right so that people are thrilled to have you around. And encourage that. That's what you want to do as a parent, as well as inculcating the order. And so, you know, and in this little diagram, I indicated that there's God the Father with the Son behind him, and he's ruling over this walled city. So he's like the meta spirit of the walled city. It's very, very nice image, brilliant image. So it's the collective spirit of the city. That's another way of thinking about it, or the collective spirit of the city across time, or the collective spirit of the force that built and maintained the city across time. Even better. And that's associated with the sun, because it's associated with enlightenment and illumination, and all of those things that we associate with higher consciousness and vision. It's a brilliant image. And then I overlaid this, you know. Now, of course, the patriarchal aspect of existence can become tyrannical. It does that quite regularly. It's one of the existential dangers of human civilization, is that civilization is a medication for chaos, but it can spin out of control in and of itself and become its own sort of problem, which is like a hyper-order problem generally, which then produces a chaos problem. So every solution carries within it certain problems, right? Because no solution is perfect, and so you have to keep things in balance. But it's one of the reasons that I'm really let's call it irritated about the postmodernists, because they keep yammering about the patriarchy. And it's very, very annoying because it's self-evident that social structures are tyrannical. It's like, that's not news, folks. That's obvious. But that's not all they are. And it's the reduction of the entire complex solution, let's say, to a unidimensional problem. It's just tyranny. It's like, no, actually, it's not just tyranny. If you spent 6 months somewhere that was just tyranny, you'd know the difference very, very rapidly. And that doesn't mean that everyone doesn't give up a pound or 2 or 10 or 20 of flesh to participate, even in a society that's as free as a Western society is. We all get crushed and molded by the tyrannical force of social convention. But at least in principle, the benefit is worth the cost. And then it's also up to you to make sure that you don't sacrifice more to the group than you should. And you can start to tell if you're sacrificing more to the group than you should, because you start to become resentful of other people. That's part of the psychological mechanism that's informing you of that. So it's up to you to fight against the overarching pressure for conformity, to retain your individual logos, let's say. But that's sort of your problem. It's like the group wants you to behave. Now, if you could behave and be creatively productive, so much the better, but that's pretty damn rare. So the group generally tends to settle just for behave, and there's a tyrannical element of that, but what the hell's the alternative? It's, our society is based on consensus, and the consensus is based on the sacrifice of a certain sacrifice of individuality, even though individuality is absolutely necessary as a revitalizing force for the society. It's a very tough thing to manage properly. So anyways, you have your physiological structure as your first line of ordering in relationship to chaos, because your body presents you with the world in a certain way. And then the second line of defense is something like the sociological structure that you inhabit. We could call those the competency hierarchies or something like that. And thank God for them, because, maybe you're going to be able to specialize in 1 or 2 things in your life, or 5 things, but there's 300 things you need to know. And if it's just you, you'll be doing your genius level mathematics while your bathtub is leaking all over your bathroom floor. And that's not so good, so you can call a plumber, and hooray for that. So, we tend to cooperate to keep chaos under control. And we tend to cooperate to keep order under control. And that's the political dialogue, right? We maintain the culture to keep chaos under control, and we balance the culture out properly to keep the culture under control. And that way we get to live reasonably peacefully, reasonably productively, for a reasonable amount of time. And that's the best that we can do. And we should have some gratitude when that's working, because the default condition of things is that not only do they not work very well, they work worse and worse over time all by themselves. So anytime anything is working, you should just be amazed by it. All right, so what does the frame look like? Well, I think it looks something like this, and this is, as far as I can tell, this is the bare bones. This is the bare bones of a variety of things. It's a bare bones story. It's a bare bone conceptual framework. It's a bare bone Dasein, to speak in Heideggerian terms. It's the bare bones world that you live in. You're always in one of these worlds. There's no getting out of them. You can move from one to another, but you're always in a world like this. And so this is the world that you're in. You're somewhere, because you have to be somewhere. Now, you might not know where that is, which means that the somewhere that you are is chaotic, in which case you need to go over your past in great detail and figure out where you are. It's like you're lost, right? You're lost, and the problem with being lost is when you're lost, you don't know where to go, and the problem with not knowing where to go is there's a million places that you could go, and a million places is too many places for you to go without dying. So being lost is not good. So you need to know where you are. One of the things that we built online, my partners and I, is this program called Past Authoring that helps people lay out the narrative of their past, to identify, to break their life down into 6 stages, epochs we call them, and then to identify the emotionally significant moments in each epoch and to write them out. What happened negatively, what happened positively, what the consequences were, what you derived from it, perhaps what you could have done differently, perhaps what you learned from it, all of that, so that you can narrow in, zero in on determining precisely where it is that you are right now. And people are often loath to do that because they actually don't want to know, because they'd rather be spread out in a sort of half-blind manner in the fog, hoping that the place that they're at is better than it really is, and deluding themselves by remaining vague, than to figure out, I'm right here, right now, with these specific problems. But it's actually better to do that, because if you have a set of specific problems, and you've really narrowed them down and really specified them, then you can probably start fixing them. And you can start fixing them in micro ways, bit by bit. But there's no way you can do that without knowing where you are. It's impossible. And you can kind of tell if you don't know where you are. It's quite straightforward. If you are haunted by reveries of the past, for events that are older than approximately 18 months, if they continue to come up in your mind over and over, in your dreams over and over, you haven't extracted the world out from your past experiences. The potential is still trapped in the past. And to confront the potential means to confront the dragon of the past. And of course, that's terrifying, and it can seriously be terrifying. So for example, maybe you're vague and ill-formed and ill-defined because you were abused very badly when you were a child, 4 years old, something like that. And maybe you were abused by a family member, because that's generally who does the abusing. And so that just makes it worse. And then what that means is that you've had an implicit encounter with malevolent evil that no, you've had a direct encounter with malevolent evil, but you have an implicit hypothesis of malevolent evil that's plaguing you. It's still there. It's trapped in the memories, right? It's trapped in the representational structure. And as an adult, you're now faced with the necessity of articulating that fully before you have any chance whatsoever of freeing yourself from it. And so that's no joke. Lots of times people have to go into the past. That's what the psychoanalysts do. And say, look, here something came along and just bloody well knocked me over. And it isn't even that I repressed it, which I think was, well, we won't talk about Freud's errors because Freud was a genius, so we'll just leave him alone. But sometimes it's not repression. It's just that terrible things happen to people at such a young age that there isn't a bloody chance in hell that they can figure out why they happened or what to do with them or what they mean. And then you can carry that with you, and you carry it with you. It's like your body encounters the world in stages, and it happens very rapidly. Well, it can extend over years, but the initial stages happen very rapidly. So, for example, if you're walking down the road and you hear a loud noise behind you, you'll go like this. That's a predator defense response, by the way. You crouch down, and that's to stop something from jumping on your back and getting at your neck too easily. That's like a few hundred milliseconds. It's really fast, or even faster than that. And it better be, because something like a snake, we'll say, can nail you just right now, so you better be fast. But it's low resolution. It's like danger snake, something like that, or danger predatory cat. It's that fast. And then you can unravel that and categorize it, but that takes time. You do that with emotion, and then you do it with cognition, and you can do that with long-term thinking, because maybe you've encountered someone specifically malevolent and predatory at work. That happens to people a lot, who's operating as a destructive bully and who seems to have no positive function whatsoever and is only living that out. And then you don't know what to do about it. So you're in prey mode. I don't mean this kind of mode, although that would help too. But I mean, you're acting like a prey animal, and then you have this terribly complex thing to decompose, which is, what the hell's up with this person? Why are they making my life miserable? What is it about me that allows them to make my life miserable? That's a nasty little road to walk down. And you're stuck with having to decompose it. Maybe you can't. Maybe formulating an explicit philosophy of good and evil to deal with something malevolent in your environment actually just happens to be beyond you. And that could easily be. It's certainly the case for people who are young. And it's the case for plenty of adults as well. It's no simple thing to manage. It's something, too, that often soldiers who have post-traumatic stress disorder have to do because they've encountered terrible things. They've either done them or ran into them, and they need to update their moral model of the world, or they end up in something closely approximating hell. Anyway, so you need to know where you are. That's this, what is, where are you? So you're navigating, you're a navigator, you're a sailor on an ocean, man. That's what you are. You're a mobile creature. You're going from point A to point B all the time. You're not sitting there glued to a rock like some brainless, sea creature. There's a funny little creature called a Hydra, very simple little creature. In its juvenile stage, it has a brain because it swims around, but then when it turns into an adult, it latches itself to a rock and promptly digests its brain. Because if you're just sitting on a rock and you're not moving, you don't need a brain. But that's not our issue, right? We're zipping around in the world, and so we're navigating agents. And so to navigate, there's two things you need to know. And the first is, where the hell are you? Exactly, precisely, right? Razor sharp. What's good about you and what's bad about you? By your own reckoning. You don't have to. You can ask other people, but this is a game you play yourself. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking stock. What is it that's okay about me and what needs some work? And you got to watch to not be too self-critical when you're doing that too, because that can just be another kind of flaw. And then the next is, okay, well, where are you going? What's your destination? Well, and that's what the frame is. Now, you could do that in a very sophisticated way. And you do that by thinking consciously about who it is that you are in an articulated manner and where you want to go and why and how you're going to get there. And people hardly ever do that. That's come as such an absolute shock to me as an educator. Because one of the other programs, I use this in my classes. One of the other programs in this suite of programs is called the Future Authoring Program. And I started developing it in my Maps of Meaning class, which is where some of this material is from. And I got students to write about their past. It's like, okay, we're talking about stories, so let's tell your story. Who are you? How did you get here? And what are you now? That usually helps people put things to rest, although it's quite stressful while you're doing it. Stress goes up when you're doing it, and maybe you feel miserable for a couple of weeks, and then stress goes down and it stays down. So that's also why people don't do it, because who the hell wants to have their stress go up? But if it's temporary, it's a sacrifice. So then the next issue is, well, where are you going? And one of the things that, and this I cannot understand, these students that had been in education system for 15 years, 14 years, high-end students, most of them, not once in their whole bloody life did anyone ever get them to sit down for like a day and say, all right, justify your existence. Like, well, seriously, it's like here you are in university, you're taking a bunch of courses, you've got some sort of vague career plan. It's like, defend the damn thing a bit, since you're going to go live it and everything. You're staking everything on it. It's like, what's your damn plan? And why are you so convinced that it's not the plan of a babbling fool? Because if you haven't thought about it, then it is. And if you really want to go out there and live that out, you know, one of the things Carl Jung said was that you're in a story, whether you know it or not. And then he made two nice comments about that. If it's someone else's story, you're probably going to get a bit part. And it might not be the one you want. And if it's a story that you don't know, it might be one with a really bad ending. Or maybe it's just bad period with a worse ending. And if you don't know what the story that you're living out is, maybe that's the one. You know, maybe you got that from your mother, you got it from your grandmother, you got it from your aunt, or God only knows where you picked it up, because you pick up things like mad, because that's what human beings are like. So maybe you're living a malevolent tragedy unconsciously. And then one thing you might ask yourself is, well, how wretched and miserable is your life? Let's add futile to that. How wretched, miserable, and futile is your life? And you might say, well, yeah, 70% on each count. It's like, then you're probably unconsciously living out a malevolent tragedy. And maybe that's not for the best. Oh, it's either that or the whole universe hates you, right? Or 70% hates you, you know. So anyways, you know, we got students to start writing in detail about not what they wanted. It's not a career thing. Because that's the closest people usually get, is they have a career plan. It's like, no, it's not a career plan. That's peripheral. Important, but peripheral. It's like, all right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? You know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? Two great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great, because then you could fix it. You could either repair the behavioral inadequacy or the conceptual inadequacy that you're using as a tool in that situation, or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. And so, okay, so you're living in one of these bloody things, and you might as well, it seems to me, you might as well make it the best one you could live in, because you don't have anything better to do. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't do it consciously, and this is what the psychoanalysts pointed out, is that you have innumerable quasi-autonomous subsystems that make you up, that will generate stories impulsively, and you'll just act them out. And you know that because you watch yourself over 2 weeks and you think, Jesus, I did a lot of stupid things in the last 2 weeks. And you think, why? And it's because you're a collection of somewhat random, quasi-autonomous personality units, and lacking a leader, they're just going to fire off whenever they want. First you're hungry, then you're thirsty, then you want to go to bed with your wife, then you want to sleep in, then you want to tell your boss off, then you want to curse at the guy that cuts you off in traffic. It's like you're kind of like a 2-year-old, it's one emotional frame after another vying for dominance. There's no overarching hierarchy, and there's no king at the top. And so, we already talked about pyramids of competence, and what's supposed to be at the top is you want to bring all those things together. We understand this neurologically. I'll show you some of that in a little bit. We understand this neurologically, how this maps, in some sense, right onto the neural structure of your being. You want to put something in control, and the thing that you should put in control is the bloody thing that pays attention and learns, right? Everything else in the hierarchy should be subordinate to the thing that pays attention and learns. And you could think, well, that's the message of the idea of logos. That's for sure, because logos is partly attention and partly communication. And you learn a lot by communicating with others. Okay, so you need to know where you are. Just like your GPS, which is about the closest thing we have to an intelligent cybernetic system. Those GPSs in your cars, those bloody things are pretty smart, because they know where you are, they know where you're going, and if you go off course, they recalculate your route. It's like those things are damn near alive. That's so close to intelligence. And you can tell that because they act intelligently. They solve problems continually. So and this is a cybernetic model, by the way, and cybernetic models were the models on which the GPS systems were based, so it's not accidental. So you need to know where you are, and you need to know where you're going. And then the next thing you need to know is how it is that you're going to act, move your body, how you're going to propel yourself through time and space to transform this into that. And so, okay, and then we can make that a little bit more complex because it's a bit too simple. So we'll do this. So it isn't exactly that you live in one of these, it's that you live in a nested hierarchy of these. And you could think of this as your own internal patriarchy. That's a good way of thinking about it. And maybe it could be a tyrant, or maybe it could be something that gives you security and functional autonomy, and hopefully that's the one you go for. But it's a battle, because a little bit of tyranny exists in everyone. And so at the very highest level of analysis, so that would be the overarching story. Maybe you think, I'd like to be a good person, or a successful person, or famous person. I think good's probably better, because you can come up with the definition of good if you want, as long as it doesn't annoy other people too badly. Because they'll just get in your way, and that won't be helpful. So you have to negotiate it. But let's say you're a good person. That's sort of the story at the top of the hierarchy, and then you could decompose that into your primary roles. Maybe you're a good parent, maybe you're a good employer, or maybe you're a good employee, maybe you're a good sibling, maybe you're a good child. Those are major roles that you have in your life. And so you'd say that what good person is what's good about you across all those roles. So it's a higher order abstraction from something more concrete. And then you can take the role good parent, and you can say, well, what is it that constitutes a good parent? And you might say, well, a good parent, this isn't exhaustive, obviously. A good parent has a good job and takes care of his or her family. And then you might say, well, what does it mean to take care of your family? And then you might say, well, you can cook the odd meal, not too odd, hopefully. You can cook the odd meal, and you can play with the baby. And then you might say, well, how do you play with a baby? And then you might say, well, you play peekaboo with the baby, or you tickle the baby. Okay, well, there's a cool shift there, because this is all articulated and conceptual, right? Right down to this level, and then all of a sudden it's your body. Because how do you play peekaboo with a baby? You don't have a chat about how you play peekaboo with a baby, right? You go like this. It's quite fun. You could even do it with older people. They even smile about it, right? Dad's gone, and the baby's all shocked to death about that. Where'd he go?